Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Rethinking Our Ride. Micromobility adapts to the new normal. Before we start our panel today, we are joined by Laura Fredericks, a member of Families for Safe Streets. Laura will be sharing a personal story on why the Vision Zero initiative is so important. Laura.
Thank you, Phil, and good afternoon. My name is Laura Fredericks, and I am a member of Families for Safe Streets, Greater Philadelphia chapter. On November 28th, 2017, that's the day that changed our family forever. On that day, my 24-year-old daughter, Emily, was cycling to work in Philadelphia when the driver of a sanitation truck made a right hook into her and killed her. Emily was traveling in the bike lane, although it was unprotected. So a little about Emily, since every second of every day we miss her, think about her, and continue to love her. Emily's goal during high school was to become a doctor, but her creative side took over, and she graduated from Johnson & Wales University with a degree in baking and pastry. She had recently moved to Philadelphia from Naples, Florida, where she had worked at the prestigious Ritz-Carlton. She had landed a job at La Cherie, a high-end French restaurant, as the head pastry chef. Emily was kind, a joy to be with. She was creative and funny, and she was not afraid to love or be loved. Her laugh was contagious. She was happy to be closer to home to us in New Jersey, and we saw her often in the 6 months that she was in Philadelphia. Traffic violence changes families forever. There will always be an empty seat at holidays, and family celebrations are now filled with such sadness and loss. Emily's two brothers, Michael and Jack, will forever miss their sister, and those feelings cannot be put into words. November 28th will be 3 years since Emily was taken from us. I still cannot believe she's gone, and I'm heartbroken in the tragic and traumatic way she was killed. I still expect her to walk through the door. When a parent loses their child, they've lost their future. Oh, what a truth to those words. I feel like I'm carrying a weighted blanket with me, but my husband and I are trying to take our grief and sadness and take action against unsafe streets. We know that speed kills and that infrastructure is vital in saving lives. And drivers need to be held accountable for killing our loved ones. The driver who killed Emily was reckless, and because of our efforts, was criminally charged, but we are still waiting for a court date almost 3 years later. Complacency is the enemy, and together our voices and our actions can help save lives. Please remember the numbers you hear during this Vision Zero conference represent lives, futures lost, and families torn apart. I want to thank all of those involved in the Vision Zero conference for their commitment to safe streets, and we are thankful for the support of all of the other families involved with Families for Safe Streets. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for your moving testimonial. It reminds us of why our work towards Vision Zero is so important. As we explore today's topic, we will keep your message of action and creating people-first cities at its core. So thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
So from there, we will move on to our panel discussion, Rethinking Our Ride. Micromobility adapts to the new normal. Next slide, please. A little bit about our agenda today. So we will do brief introductions. We will then have speaker presentations and then a panel discussion for 30 minutes. Q&A after that, once we've concluded our discussion. Next slide, please. And a little description about what we're going to be talking about today. As cities recover from COVID-19, we all have an opportunity to define the new normal. This panel will explore changes that have happened and taken place during COVID-19 in the world of micromobility and discuss how cities can leverage micromobility to shape a more safe, equitable, and sustainable transportation system. This panel brings together thought leaders from around the globe to discuss how cities are approaching micromobility differently and how this aligns with cities' safety initiatives. Next slide, please. And now on to our panelists. Barb Chamberlain has served as the first director of the Active Transportation Division at the Washington State Department of Transportation since it was created in March 2017, in reflection of the agency's commitment to multimodal transportation. In this role, she leads policy planning and capacity building for walking, rolling, and other forms of accessible, healthy, sustainable, and equitable active transportation. Previously, she served in numerous civic volunteer roles in transportation and health, including an NPO board and Regional Health Foundation. Before coming to WSDOT, Chamberlain was executive director of Washington Bikes, the statewide advocacy organization, headed a public affairs work for a research university campus, and served in the Idaho State Legislature as a state representative and senator. Welcome, Barb. Our next panelist, Henry Greenidge, is an attorney and transportation professional with over 10 years of experience in policy advising and legal advocacy. His areas of expertise span infrastructure issues such as broadband, energy, sustainability, and mobility, including autonomous transportation and micromobility. Henry is the founder of Our Mobile Future, which focuses on fostering equity-driven solutions in mobility. Henry is currently a fellow in residence at the NYU McSilver Institute of Poverty, Policy, and Research, where he focuses on the intersection between race, poverty, transportation, and urban technology. Previously, he led regional public affairs for Cruise, a GM majority-owned company focused on autonomous vehicle technology. Henry holds a Juris Doctor from University of Baltimore and a Bachelor of Arts from the Scripps Howard School of Journalism and Communications at Hampton University, where he graduated with honors. Thank you, Henry, for joining us. Our next panelist is Julie Kretien. She is a doctor in sociology, University of East Paris, and an engineer with a specialization in urban planning and transports from the École Nationale des Ponts et Chaussées, who analyzes mobility behavior using both qualitative and quantitative methods. With a focus on the relationships between individuals' time use and mobility constraints, she deals with questions of accessibility, as well as gender and inclusive cities. In parallel, she is working on the role of new digital tools in making the analysis of mobility. Thank you for joining us, Julie. And our last panelist, Phil Jones, is Lime's Senior Government Relations Director for the Northeast and the National Cities Initiative. At Lime, Phil seeks to bring smart, equitable, and sustainable mobility solutions to the people of the tri-state region and the entirety of the nation. A resident of New York for over 15 years, Phil has worked for elected officials on the federal, state, and local level with a focus on workers' rights, access to quality education, and protecting the city's most vulnerable. Building social equity for New Yorkers has been a privilege and driving force in Phil's personal activism and professional life. Creating a level playing field and ending transportation disparity with Lime as a senior director is a natural evolution of that activism. At its core, Lime's goal is simple: transforming the way people experience urban movement and leave future generations with a cleaner and healthier planet. Thank you to all of our guests today. Next slide, please. Next slide. So from there, we will go into our first presentation, which will be from Julie Chrétien and her learnings from Paris. Julie?
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be the first speaker today. I'm going to present the case of Paris and how things have changed for Paris since the beginning of COVID. The first element I wanted to share was a bit of context, basically. I wanted to put in perspective what micromobility currently represents on peak hour morning trips. Can you, next slide, please? So basically right now in Paris, peak hour is 7 to 9 a.m. and there are 2 million people in public transport and 2 million people in cars. By contrast, only about 800 people are driving bikes, and we assume also are eventually on scooters and individual engines and so on and so forth. So basically, we can consider that bicycles and micromobility is about 5% of modal share on peak hour. So this was pre-COVID in 2018 and 2019. How did things change with COVID? Concretely, next slide, please. Concretely, what happened was that with COVID, public transport lines appeared suddenly as something dangerous. It used to be that safety was considered as an accidentology problem. Now safety is seen as a proximity problem, which suddenly made public transport lines, which were seen as very safe transport, suddenly something become something dangerous. So concretely, for who did it become dangerous to go around? It became dangerous to ride saturated public transport lines, and who rides in saturated public transport lines. Concretely, two kind of people. Going from east to west are mainly white collars and executives who are going to work in La Défense, the central business district in the west of Paris. So this is one of the most saturated lines, with the RERA. And then going north to south are three lines, the Metro Line 13 and RER B and D, which are in great part taken by workers and employees who are coming from the rather poorer suburbs in the north of Paris and are going to work either in the center of Paris or are going in the center to take the RERA and go to La Défense equally. So who rides in public transport, saturated public transport lines? White collars on one hand and relatively poor workers on the other hand. So concretely, when COVID struck, white collar workers were able to telework, so ridership online RERA was able to drop. But very quickly, what we saw was that on lines 13 B and D, the north to south lines, ridership was back up very quickly because these were essential workers who weren't able to find an alternative to public transport. Next slide, please. So concretely, at first, the RATP, the public ridership, the public transport, and the SNCF, which operates some of the lines, decided to cut by half capacity in order to ensure social distancing. The question was, where do we put 1 million people? Remember, 2 million people at peak hour in the morning. So where do we put 1 million people? And as I said, part of the solution was telecommuting, which was possible for white collars. But as I said, for workers and employees, this was not possible. And by mid-August, ridership was 60% of usual numbers. And line 13, B and D were back at saturation level. Next slide. The other solution to ensure social distancing was basically for people to take their car. For who was that possible? Well, for people who owned a car. It happens to be that in Paris, only a third of the population owns a car. And in the northern suburbs, only about half of the population owns a car. In many cases, anyways, it is very difficult to drive one's car in the center of Paris. Which means that if you look on the graph on the right, which shows levels of congestion compared to 1 year earlier, it is blue when it is lower, it is red when it is higher. All the way to your right is the situation in September 2020. And what you see is that we are back with little red dots, which means that congestion is back to its almost normal level since compared to 1 year ago, which means that in spite of the fact that many people are telecommuting still and that unemployment has risen, saturation of the road network is already back to its normal levels. So concretely, cutting by half or limiting the ridership in the public transport was really not an option because many people rely on it. We cannot suddenly make larger roads for more cars. Cars take a lot of space. And so what is the third solution? Well, third solution was to install a temporary bike path. Next slide, please. So the solution the city of Paris and the suburban municipalities decided to put in place was to set up in a hurry a temporary bike path. this both anticipated and accompanied a rise in ridership. I only have bicycle ridership, or at least what we assume are bicycles, but it probably includes scooters too. Ridership in general on the paths which already existed, ridership nearly doubled in Paris between July of 2020, so post lockdown, and July 2019, so a year before. We did a study on who rode the new cycle path, and we saw that 86% of the new cyclists, people who said that they started cycling after the COVID, 86% of those new cyclists would have taken public transport if the bike used to take public transport, and amongst those 40% would have taken public transport if it weren't for the temporary bike path. So we can say that the temporary bike path were one of the reasons that made it possible for bicycle and e-scooter ridership to rise post-COVID. The second element, which is interesting about installing these bike paths, is that although they are not entirely installed in Paris, some of them go all the way to the suburbs. And if you look at it a bit closer, you see that some of the bike paths which were installed follow the lines which I showed earlier as being the most saturated in Paris. So on one part, of course, they did an east to west line, which basically doubled which mirrored the metro line, RER line, which I mentioned earlier, which was taken by the white colors. But also they made two north to south lines, which mirror the line 13 of the metro and the lines RER B and D. So basically they set up temporary lines, not only so that Parisians could travel in Paris, but also so that people working in the nearby suburbs and who usually would take public transport, so that some of them be able to come into Paris. What impact has all of this had on who rides a bike in Paris? Next slide, please. What's interesting is that of the people, we were able to compare people who didn't cycle before COVID to people who did cycle before COVID. And what is interesting is that we've seen a rise in the share of women rider. I don't know how it is in other countries, but in France, men are overrepresented amongst riders. And what we saw was that the new cyclists basically were more often women than amongst the older cyclists, or people who rode their bicycles before COVID existed. And we also saw a rise in the share of employees and workers, so non-executives amongst cyclists. We now have, amongst people using those cycle lanes, nearly 50% were employees and workers, whereas less than a third used to make it up, only less than a third of the veteran cyclists. In summary, faced with problems of congestion and where to put people when social distancing became necessary, it seems that building infrastructure, which for a long time was seen as complicated, suddenly COVID made possible things that we thought were impossible, and not only as far as infrastructure, but also as far as the population who uses this infrastructure. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Julie. So from there, we're going to move on to Barb. And Barb, if you could please share your learnings from Washington. Thank you.
So happy to. Thanks so much. As he said, my name is Barb Chamberlain. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm speaking to you from the traditional lens of the Nisqually people. I'm in Olympia, which is a town of about 50,000 or so, and it's cut into quarters by I-5 and State Route 101. I'm sort of surrounded by the work of my agency, you might say. So I'm going to share the context for our active transportation work, and we define that to include micromobility. It's whatever human scale wheeled device sets you free. My next slide illustrates the kinds of things that have happened over time. My next slide illustrates what's happened over time that we are taking into account as we work on our active transportation plan and our projects as an agency. William Gibson gets quoted a lot said the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. The past wasn't evenly distributed either. And those effects are showing up every day. They show up in our crash data. They show up in disparities in health and who's exposed to pollutants. What kinds of roads you live with are the result of specific decisions. And that's a history I'm learning that I wasn't taught in school. Maybe you're also learning it, or maybe your family lived through this history and experienced these painful burdens firsthand. Either way, this is something we all need to be cognizant of as we do our work. The next slide is a graphic that you'll find in our strategic highway safety plan called Target Zero. We were the first state in the nation to set 0 as the goal for traffic safety deaths. This hierarchy of controls is borrowed from workplace safety and public health and other realms. And if you apply it to transportation and traffic safety, what you have to start from is that the responsibility for traffic safety shifts from the user to the designer. So that top level of eliminating the exposure to the crash is the most effective. And that means most cost effective over its life cycle. And it saves more lives. And we heard Laura tell Emily's story and how important is that work. That's the work we all need to be doing every day. An analogy for this is if you think about electricity, I do not have to buy special gloves in order to be able to touch the light switch in my house. Something that could kill me has been stepped down to an appropriate level, and I've been insulated from the danger. So if we thought about our streets in this systemic safety way, we wouldn't say that safety rests on aftermarket add-ons, and we would not outsource traffic safety to law enforcement either. So these are things that we can discuss as we move into the Q&A. My next slide will share a bit of what's been happening in Washington State. If I showed you the slides for driving, toll lanes specifically, transit, passenger rail, ferries, all of those would show lines going down. This is a snapshot from our multimodal transportation dashboard showing walking and rolling are up, up, up. And I can't pull out micromobility. That doesn't get counted separately. But what we see is that in a crisis, people go back to basics. And just this week, I learned information about what's happening for mental health in Washington State, and this would be true about the nation, that about 40% of our population will have a clinical level of a mental health concern, whether that is depression or anxiety or something else. Probably also related that alcohol sales in July were 80% higher than a year ago. But the clinical psychologist who was sharing this noted it's important that people were getting outside in the summer, that was one of the things that was making it possible to flatten the behavioral health curve, if you will. And so we need to keep getting outside. That means having a place to do that safely. The next slide gives you an idea of what we've done as an agency. We looked at what the cities were doing, and they were doing, flexible and creative, quick changes. And in Washington State, over 400 miles of state highways are through somebody's downtown, and they're about 35 miles an hour or less as a speed limit. That means there's land use that would be supportive of walking or rolling, but maybe that street doesn't feel comfortable because when we built it as a state route, there wasn't a town there, perhaps. So we'd set up a process for quick, flexible changes, similar to the way we'd handle a work zone permit or a parade permit. And so you see something like this restaurant using a couple of parking spaces. This implementation, though, I would say if you think about the cities doing this, if they did this for economic reasons, which was part of our rationale, that's different than starting from your high injury network and saying, where should we put these because it doesn't feel safe or it isn't, there's a lot of crashes happening on this street. That's a different street maybe than a street that's got your economic activity or a different street than your neighborhood greenway. So as cities think about where to do this, the reasons they're making these street changes, we need to think about those goals and how we're going to measure those. And if you applied a gender framework, you think about connecting the places that are more often accessed by women. It's really interesting with Julie's data that in Paris, more women are riding than used to because managing family needs, we know, is still falling out in a gendered way. The next slide shows you a couple of things happening in our Vision Zero cities in Washington. On the left, we have a neighborhood greenway in Bellevue, where they did apply an equity framework. That was a key factor in choosing their healthy streets corridors. So they put them on streets that didn't have sidewalks, in places with higher percentages of households that are living in poverty, or where there are more folks who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, more households without access to a motor vehicle. So that's an example. Seattle did something similar, but the picture I chose to illustrate for them is one of those downtown sort of economic activity locations. So at the state and local level in Washington, we're trying to be responsive. My next slide, I'm wrapping up and looking forward to the discussions we'll have in the Q&A and the other speakers. Climate change is still and always coming at us. And so the work we're doing in response to the pandemic, we think of as preparing ourselves for the world we want to have. We need to start from that equity foundation and framework. If you don't do that, the structure won't stand. Applying a safe systems approach will give us self-enforcing streets that are more comfortable for everyone, and we can stop criminalizing everyday behavior of people just trying to get somewhere. If we complete our walk and roll network, people will use it for walking and rolling. We did it for driving, and lo and behold, people drove. And we can test and adapt and be learning agencies and build the future we want that will actually be more evenly distributed, I hope, more resilient and sustainable, safe, healthy, equitable, and really welcoming system for everyone. Thanks so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Barb. From there, we'll be moving on to a presentation from Henry Greenidge, and he will be sharing his learnings from NYU. Henry.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Really want to thank Laura for sharing that powerful story and for centering this conversation. You know, we often need to be reminded of why we do what we do. And I think her example, her story was one that certainly helped me. So next slide. So as Phil mentioned, I am a transportation fellow in residence at the NYU McSilver Institute, which is under the Silver School at NYU. And really what we're looking to do with this fellowship is explore issues behind transportation, race, and poverty. We felt that after COVID-19, this pandemic that has fundamentally changed the way we look at everything, more conversation needed to be had about Black communities and the impact that transportation has had and continues to have. You know, we often hear about the role that transportation plays and how it can become an equalizer. And for Black communities, that simply has not been the case. Transportation has been at the heart of the civil rights fight for Black communities. And while many strides have been made, there's still quite a bit of work to do. Now, what micromobility does is it really offers us a chance to reset a foundation that is fundamentally broken. One of the examples I often use is that, you know, where you have a house and a home that's built on a faulty foundation, do you continue to build on top of it? No, you actually start from scratch and you make sure that your foundation is proper. And so in many respects, that's what we have to do with transportation to ensure that our system is actually equitable. So I'll be focusing on equity, but that's sort of a misnomer the way I have this slide presented, because safety and engagement, while important, they need to be rooted in equity. So next slide. Okay, so this graphic we've seen often. You know, you have equality where everyone has a stool. We have equity where there are stools provided for those that need one. And then the final one, which I really enjoy, it's the fence that is being removed. It's this barrier. It's this idea of liberation, which quite frankly, we don't see often enough. But the main point of this slide is to recognize that when I'm talking about equality, I'm being very specific in talking about racial equality. In order to get to equity. I'm talking about racial equity. And in order to get to racial equity, you really need to focus on it. Next slide. Okay, so I kept this image in here because what we often see often leads to how we think. There are a number of images out there of what the ideal consumer is for micromobility and for e-scooters. But the reality is it's much more complex than that. We have all kinds of people which this wonderful technology can help serve. But we need to be cognizant of some of the images that we're putting out there. I do think that things are getting better. And through the work with NYU, we do see strides being made and folks having conversations with different communities. But we do have to focus on perception and what images we see. Next slide. So the equity-centered approach. Again, we're talking about racial equity here, and what we need to do is actually apply it to everything. Now, this slide is a little off because what you have is safety, policy, design, outreach, all things that need to be applied under our equity framework. They're all the same size here. That's not actually how it works. The way I tend to think about equity is, equity is, this symphony orchestra, right? And, you've got the wind section, you've got the percussion section, which could be justice. You've got all these different sections playing to create this music. And equity is the driving force behind it. Next slide. So here's the fine print about equity that we've discovered through working with cities and different organizations. Number one, when organizations come to NYU, a lot of them have policy statements, but they're not specific about how they're defining equity. Are they talking about racial equity? Are they talking about social, gender, geographic equity? That needs to be addressed from the beginning in order to affect your outcome. The second thing is it requires intentionality at every single level. You can't skip levels. It is very difficult work because essentially what we're doing is we're trying to roll back generations of inequitable treatment, especially in Black communities. And so you've got to be intentional about how you're operationalizing equity. The next one is being flexible and adaptable. And I think that's probably the biggest thing here. With equity work, you have to account for things that you can't predict, and you have to be really flexible on your goals, your timelines, and your outcomes. Again, we are coming from a place where our transportation ecosystem was really rooted in systemic racism. And that was coming both from the public sectors with the federal government and the private sector as well. You had everyone sort of working together to ensure that, quite frankly, segregation persisted. And so in order to undo that, you really have to be flexible, and you really have to understand that it takes time, and that your outcome may not be the one that you want it to be. The next one is just active participation. If you're not actively working to dismantle systemic racism in the transportation ecosystem, you're allowing it to persist. And I think this is a big one. It's a one that really hits home for me. I worked in the space for a number of years. I worked on many wonderful initiatives at the federal and the local levels, but I wasn't really being intentional about equity and acknowledging who is actually going to be impacted by my work and what that meant in terms of history and what that means for Black communities. And so in order to really take advantage of this wonderful technology like micromobility, you really have to be active in making sure that you're working to dismantle this systemic racism. Next slide. Okay, so, I mentioned that equity is infused in essentially everything you do. A big part of that is safety and education when it comes to micromobility. I think now is an opportune time to rethink our language. If you ask folks who work outside of the industry what micromobility is, they have no idea. I think, again, we need to be specific. We're talking about e-scooters and it's e-scooters. If it's e-mopeds, it's e-mopeds. We need to think about how we're communicating these messages to the general public, because this is a big deal. Often we talk about, reforms being needed in the education space and the criminal justice space. And what often gets left behind is the transportation space. And that is something that fundamentally needs to change, but we as an industry need to do better about using terms and language that includes everyone and language that can ensure that everyone understands what we're talking about. Also under education, I think we really need to take a look at how we're working with elementary schools. I think it's a missed opportunity. And thinking about my own childhood, you learned to look both ways before crossing at school. You learned about driver's ed. All of these things need to be incorporated as we plan for the future of transportation, including micromobility. The biggest questions out there are how safe are these scooters and whether they will cause other issues. The next one, enforcement. We really have to broaden the idea of safety to include street safety and justice, as well as traffic safety. And then we also have to learn how to engage law enforcement much better because of the impact that it has on our consumers. Next slide. So now this next slide really is focusing on something that should hit home for many of us, and this idea of biking while Black. And this is the thing that we're trying to avoid. These headlines are taken from 2019 and 2020 stories, and they barely scratch the surface of what this issue is. We need to ensure that micromobility does not face the same fate. And there are steps that have been taken, which I think we need to look at to see if we can bring about other better lessons learned to ensure that, e-scooters don't suffer the same fate as biking while black. Next slide. Okay, so the case study I want to use is Lime, and I know Phil is on here, but we actually didn't talk about me including this until after I had already done it. One of the things that they did was great because they worked with a local police department to create what they call micromobility code enforcement officers to, number one, educate riders, to facilitate this conversation of what it's like to change the behavior and really take advantage of micromobility. And number two, enforcement. Enforcement always has to be there, but we have to ensure that people feel safe when dealing with law enforcement. And I think what Lime did is really a proactive approach to addressing these two issues, and we need more out of the box thinking. If we're talking about rethinking our ride, now is not the time to stay in the box. We need to do things a little bit differently than we have in the past. Next slide. Rethinking engagement is a big one, especially in this era of a pandemic. Now, traditionally, you had your political, policy, and community stakeholders. In New York, what we saw is the convergence of the advocacy and the safety community coming together with the technology companies like Lime and Bird to really put forward a solution that elected officials could get behind. I thought that was a nice way of looking for ways to work together, and it's something that other technologies should look to as they look to deploy as well. We should also consider new approaches, just given the moment that we're in. Who's included at the table? Who is leading the engagement? What do they look like? What are the biases that they bring to the table? How is feedback being incorporated? These are all things that we need to do better at. I also think, just given the era that we are in, the strategic use of digital tools is really important. We also need to think about compensating community members who go above and beyond in terms of working with us and giving feedback to our approaches. And again, this whole idea of having a flexible timeline is really important. Next slide. So now, part of the work at NYU is we talk with a lot of different organizations, whether they're academic institutions, whether they're technology companies, whether they're city governments. And these are a list of 10 things that we thought was most helpful in terms of making sure that equity is rooted in everything we do in terms of advancing mobility. Number one, an employee-led process at these tech companies to determine why racial equity is important. That why needs to be number one. I can tell you, for me, the why is, recognizing that I've been in this space, in this industry for a number of years, and had not really given much thought into how my work impacts Black communities. I could honestly see how others don't see it as well. And so making sure you understand your why is critically important. There are some others on there. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but we really need to rethink some of our principles. We need to revisit how we're operationalizing equity. And we need to do so recognizing that micromobility can really be this gateway, a gateway to ensuring that the next generation of technology can help us resolve some of the ills of the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry, for your presentation. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about what Lime has been able to discover through its national and global surveys on ridership and how things have progressed in micromobility pre-COVID and now during a COVID spike that we're enduring at the moment. So next slide, please. What we've learned is that micromobility and scooters specifically have grown quickly. This is primarily due to two reasons, according to our global rider survey. One, as you can see here, is that nearly 50% of riders use scooters because they are fast and convenient. And we know this based upon the traffic engineering concepts that show that bike lanes move roughly 3 times more people per hour than mixed traffic lanes. And if you're looking at what was going on during the pandemic, there were fewer cars on the road. So we saw a very steep uptick in ridership and new riders actually trying out scooters and bicycles. And what we also saw, which is important to note, is that nearly 30% of riders choose scooters and e-bicycles because they see them as fun and an easy and convenient way to get around. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at exactly what we're doing with our micromobility on the streets, and that's scooters and bicycles, the first thing that comes to mind is roadway safety. And not only are bikes and scooters popular, but what we found is that they are overwhelmingly safe. According to Lime's analysis, In our data in the US is that 99.985% of Lyme riders are incident-free. And of the reported incidents, 93% were reported as minor scrapes, cuts, or bruises that did not require medical attention. And what we've noticed is that when there is an incident, scooter riders or bicycle riders are not responsible for those crashes. And this is important to note because as we notice and have seen through the data and what Transportation Alternatives has been doing and Families for Safe Streets has been doing, is that pedestrians, scooters, bicyclists are very, very rarely the cause of crashes that take place. So this data is very significant in terms of how we are looking at and creating safety for all modes of transportation on the street. Next slide, please. So another thing here is that when we're diving a little bit deeper into the safety conversation, it's important to note that the general public really understands the perceptions of travel before and during after COVID. And what we found is that during our COVID peak, there was a drop in transit and ride hailing. People were not riding trains because of fear of contracting COVID-19. And also we saw fewer cars on the street because of shutdowns and mandatory stay-at-home orders. What we now notice post-COVID, and what we expect to see happen from our survey as the data shows, is that there will be a return to normal travel patterns in transit and ride hailing. But we will also see that increase of micromobility holding steady. So if you're looking at the data on the right side of your screen, you're really getting a picture of the mode shift. What people were doing prior to COVID, what they were doing during COVID, and now what they're doing as it's become a little bit more normal for them to have access to micromobility. And what we've really seen is that scooters and shared micromobility, of course, provide socially distanced travel. And that's something that people are very, very interested in doing at this stage. And scooters have also offered an alternative connection point for transit. So people are using them to actually cover that first and last mile to get to their main form of transportation. And we've seen a drop in the uses of cars. And that's something that we know a lot of cities have been paying attention to. And this is something that we're seeing as a global trend. And I know another question is about the safety of the platforms themselves. So when we're doing our operations in our warehouses and also rebalancing the scooters and bikes, we really want to do everything we can to mitigate the transmission and risk. So we're utilizing PPE, which is professional protective equipment, and also servicing and rebalancing our vehicles. When we do so, we're actually cleaning and reprocessing those scooters to make sure that they remain safe for all riders. And we also are doing education campaigns that push our riders and those in the community to make sure that they're practicing safe hygiene to keep themselves okay as well. Next slide. So one of the things I want to note here is that when we're looking at our survey data from some of our major operations, and that would be San Francisco and Washington, DC, Lyme travel has shifted from downtowns and central business areas to neighborhood locations. So as we're seeing people not go into their city centers, not going into work to their office buildings, they really started using micromobility as a way to get around their neighborhoods. And we've also seen an uptick in the approach to them actually using their local businesses, because when they're on their scooter, they're on their bicycle, it's a lot easier for them to stop and check out a new location, but also do things that are closer to them in a 10-minute radius that is actually able for them they're able to access through scooter use. So as we've seen that happen with them becoming less active, we've seen an uptick in the use of dock-free mobility, and we're able to adapt quickly to that because we're not based in docks. We don't have to worry about them being unused in certain areas where people are not going now. So we can actually move our platforms to areas where they actually have access to them and are able to use them for their day-to-day travel in any of the modes of utilization that they want to take on there. Next slide, please. So while travel in neighborhoods has increased, riders are still using Lyme for commute and errands, and that's important to note. So even though we have seen this shift to neighborhoods, people are still using them for their day-to-day travel to get to their job, to get to school, and to get to any other necessary activity that they need to actually do. So as we saw in Paris, while many office workers are now working remotely, there are still essential workers who need options for getting to work in all neighborhoods and at all times. So roughly 50% of surveyed riders say they use Lime for commute, transit, and access to errands, which is important. Another 20% use Lime for access to social distance, for social destinations, such as coffee shops and restaurants. That actually speaks to the local business and exploring their neighborhood, as I mentioned before. And the remaining riders use Lime for recreation and to get out and get some fresh air. I know a lot of us have been doing Zoom calls and working from home. So actually having the ability to get out, explore your local neighborhood, maybe do a little bit more than you normally could without hopping in a car, especially if you don't have access in a lot of our urban areas. This is a way for them to do that. Recent data from New York Department of Health and Mental Hygiene backs our findings as well on travel during COVID. Where further out stations and outer boroughs saw far smaller drops in ridership than the nearly 90% drop in ridership that took place in Manhattan. And this really signifies longer trips and a need for commuter alternatives. Because when we're looking at the communities that are most affected and the people who are most likely to be essential workers, they're coming from historically underserved communities, and most of those communities are often Black and brown. So having access to an affordable form of transportation that gets them to their main form of transportation or is an alternative to that main transportation without them having to take a ride hail is important. And that's something that we feel micromobility provides. Next slide, please. So as changing travel patterns and growth and popularity of shared micromobility, what does that mean for us? It means that infrastructure is needed for these type of transportation modes. Open streets has become popular in many cities to offer space for social distance travel. And what we've concluded from our general population survey is that most of the respondents want to keep some form of or all forms of open streets. And what does that mean? It really means that people have seen the benefit of being able to use their street space for all different types of activity. So not only is that them reclaiming it as a pedestrian, them walking, them being able to use pedal bikes, but also having access to micromobility to use those open streets as well. And our analysis found that when people were making these changes, they were actually using other forms of transportation outside of their car, which is important when we're looking at a lot of the initiatives that cities and states are looking to do when it comes to congestion. And just anecdotally, this mirrors a lot of what we saw in New York when we saw the advent of open streets during the pandemic, and also now seeing that it's going to be something that stays with us and is something that we can build upon for the future. Next slide, please. So the data that we have here is where we conducted a survey of 3 European cities, Paris, London, and Berlin. And the 2 timeframes that we looked at were February 2020, pre-COVID, and June 2020, post-COVID, during the spike. And the questions that we asked were, what were your thoughts on new bike lanes and usage, pre-existing bike lanes and usage, and no bike lanes and usage? Citywide ridership increased by 15% between February and June, and distance increased by 68%. And if you can look at the next graph here, is that ridership increased by 11% on new bike lanes, and only 49% on streets with pre-existing bike lanes, and 45% on streets with no bike lanes. So as we're building out infrastructure, as we're really making these investments, you can see that people want and will use micromobility on those new streets that are seen as main thoroughfares. And I know Julie touched upon this in her presentation as well, is that if we do put the infrastructure down, people will use it. And furthermore, trips on routes that have installed bike lanes experience a dramatic increase in ridership, highlighting their popularity and importance. So if we really want to see a mode shift, we want to make it something that's permanent and providing people with options, we have to invest in infrastructure. And when we do that, we will see a change in usage and also an increase of multi-uses and multi-modes for our street ecosystem. So from there, I think we can enter into our panel discussion. So we'll go to the next slide. And just in conclusion, I just want to share with our findings that what we've seen globally and nationally is that people really do want alternatives. They want different modes of transportation that can actually ease their trip for the day. And as Henry pointed out, if we are really looking at making this equitable, we can't just do a blanket number statement. We have to work closely with community. We have to work closely with our elected officials in those neighborhoods and the advocates who have been doing this work for decades to make sure that we are really hitting the mark in how we're applying and building any new form of transportation program, and also making it inclusive. So thank you. We can go to the next slide. So just so everyone just kind of remembers who participated in the panel today, here is a slide of all of our faces and names. But my first question is to the group. So, what COVID-19 has highlighted is how travel patterns can drastically shift when there are natural disasters. How can Dockless Micromobility help address these changes? And that's all forms of transportation as well in the mode shift. I'll start with Barb, if that's possible.
Sure, thanks for the question. If for those of you who've heard Jessica Roberts with Alta Planning talk about behavioral shifts and the nudges, she talks about how, and that's, to help mode shift occur and then persist. She talks about how life-changing moments are the most effective point. You have kids, you move, you change jobs, whatever it is that undoes your muscle memory in transportation habits is a moment of leverage for new transportation habits to form. And none of us asked for this nudge, but it is here. So I think we're sort of, in a sense, going down that path. The part where we are all behind is the infrastructure that people will feel comfortable using. We saw driving go down a lot, but driving has come back. And we haven't yet been able to unpack the data because 2020 is still happening. But we looked at March through June, year over year. Sorry, this is sort of a grim message. March through June, year over year. We had fewer collisions involving people walking and rolling. We had fewer serious injuries. We had a much higher fatality rate than the average for the last 10 years.
I think we lost you for a second there, Barb. It seems to have gone on mute. So I think we're gonna see if we can get Barb back, but can anyone else jump in on the question? Henry or Julie?
Yeah, I can definitely jump in. So I appreciated Julie's presentation about Paris. And one of the things she did not cover, and perhaps she wants to weigh in on it, is this idea of the 15-minute city, which Mayor Hidalgo instituted in Paris. And you saw that the C40 mayors, the big city mayors around the globe have signed on to it. And I think micromobility is at the center of that. And so it's this idea that, you can get to all the critical resources within 15 minutes commute time, and that's walking or through micromobility in your neighborhood. I think e-scooters play a huge role in that, especially because we've seen huge patterns of behavior change given the pandemic. And if we look at our numbers now, you have cities around the world closing down again. We've seen increased numbers in New York. We really have to plan for how we are going to adjust in the long term. So I see micromobility being coupled with other initiatives, not just Vision Zero. It's the 15-minute cities. It's the power of proximity. All of these unique ideas that we've seen in urban planning over the last few years, they're resurfacing. And I think we can look at our partners in Europe who are a little bit further along in micromobility deployment to figure out how in which we can better rethink what we're doing here in the States.
That's great, Henry. And another thing I want to note is that in the presentation, I want to make clear that this is not saying that the pandemic is over, or that COVID-19 is over. We know that it's spiking all over the world. We understand that it has and still will be affecting communities, but it's really looking at how we've been able to assess the data and looking at what we didn't know before, and now having a lot more information on how cities have dealt with it globally. We are then able to use those learnings to apply them to current cities, and also the evolution of hopefully how we can make our city stronger and better. So I do want to go back to Barb and just her comments if she's able to pick those up again. So thank you, Barb.
Sorry about that. No idea what happened to the phone. This is the world of the virtual conference. it's not a quick fix to change streets to rebalance the use. What we're seeing in our crash data that I was mentioning is when we analyze the contributing factors to our higher fatality rates, we suspect that driver speed is a piece, because we're seeing more people sort of taking advantage of the wide open road, because that's what it was designed for. So I look at these temporary reallocation projects as a way of testing future plans. And in particular, if you've already got a bike master plan or a pedestrian master plan, what could you put out today? You can put out hay bales to do a protected bike lane. It doesn't have to be something expensive and high end to just test it. And if we do that, I think we create that space that then invites more of that sort of cautious majority who are willing to do something other than driving, to get out there and try something, whether they're trying an e-scooter or a bike or whatever it might be, but they need to see the space that invites them. And then that use will encourage other people to try, and we get our safety in numbers sort of compounding positive effect.
That's a great segue into a question on Paris, because I know they were able to move pretty quickly in building out their infrastructure. And Julie, what are your thoughts on how other cities can mimic that build out, or really just look at having access to data that quickly gives us the ability to put in infrastructure, especially if it can be protected? What are your thoughts, Julie?
Yeah. So 3 things. To answer your question, the reason Paris was able to move so quickly is because it already had a plan. Paris had been meaning to develop its bicycle path for the past 10 years. It's been going slowly because, as we all know, developing new infrastructure is always slow. Paris is composed of 20 municipalities. It had to get on board every single municipality, and getting anything done in the suburbs do not depend on the city of Paris. So basically a lot of stakeholders and a lot of negotiations, and things went very slowly. So basically when suddenly all those problems were magically removed because of COVID, because everyone was like, we need a solution now, they already had the plan already rolled out, ready to be rolled out. So they already knew where there was potential and where they needed to put out stuff. I saw in the questions, one of the questions was, are these lanes protected? Yes, they are. Like small walls along those bike paths, so you really are. Everyone is freezing. Can people see it? Yeah.
We can hear you now. Thank you, Julie.
Yeah, so the bike lanes are protected from the traffic. 2 points. Earlier you asked what micromobility could do in the light of pandemic, and especially shared micromobility. I think one of the powers of shared micromobilities is its flexibility. It's enables people to have access to transportation modes which they wouldn't have. The fact is, when you consider changing transportation modes, especially if it's a bicycle or an e-scooter, if it weren't for shared micromobility, you would have to buy, and these things are expensive. And if you are considering biking or considering the e-scooters, but you don't own an e-scooter or a bicycle, this is going to be a big step. Like, you're going to be thinking about it, like, am I going to spend $200 for a mode that maybe isn't going to be adapted to my mobility? So that's the power of shared mobility. You can just say, oh, instead of buying my own e-scooter or buying my own bicycle, like, I can just download the app, pay $1.50 and see if it fits with my mobility. And eventually some people end up buying their own. But the fact is that in light of a pandemic, in light of swift changes, shared mobility is really an asset. And to answer Henry's question concerning the 15-minute city, the fact is that currently the infrastructure that has been set up is more of infrastructure for semi-long trips. The fact is, to get from the limits of Paris to the center, you have nearly half an hour of bicycle. If you want to go from the suburbs to the center, you have 45 minutes of bicycle. This is infrastructure that was made for commuters and for long commutes. And the fact is, the question we might ask ourselves is, what do we do for people who aren't commuting? What do we do for our elders? What do we do for the stay-at-home mom who still doesn't want to take public transport? And for that 15-minute city, the fact is that we don't have that many solutions. The fact is there are bike lanes, but they're not protected, so people tend to be afraid of using them. I'm thinking about what Barb said, the fact that we need to implement measures that don't necessarily mean having people enforcing external enforcement through police, making sure that people aren't speeding. We need to find other solutions. The fact is that one of the countries with the highest mode share in bicycle is Japan. They do not have bike path, and they have a very high bike share with women. And the reason that works is because in many parts, for example, in Tokyo, you have many parts of the city where there aren't any cars. And so there aren't any sidewalks either. People can walk and drive around. And many of the people who actually use the bicycle are stay-at-home moms who go grocery shopping using their bicycles, and they're not afraid to get run over. And they didn't need to invest into infrastructure.
That's a really important point. So I have one follow-up question to you, Julie. If you can provide a quick answer, would be to how long did it take to install the temporary bike lanes that were protected? Like what was the timing?
It took like 2 months. It was so fast. Like, I mean, so many years, anytime, like we spent so much time saying infrastructure is a long-term thing. We need to think about it. We need to, it takes slow. Maybe there are other solutions we can implement, which would be faster, and so on and so forth. I'm changing the advice I'm going to give. I'm going to say, hey, do you want a quick solution? Put infrastructure. You know, hey, we've seen it only takes 2 months. And they're still setting up new ones. And the fact is, in Paris, I think Paris has decided to keep most of its temporary bike lanes. Like now that it's there, it would be very difficult to go back on it. And even in the suburbs, in the western suburbs, where it's much more car friendly, it used to be, we had municipal elections at the end of June. And so they set up the bike lanes in May and June. And for example, the department, let's say the county or the region, the state, installed some bike lanes on statewide roads, and the municipalities were like, you put bike lanes on the roads that are crossing our municipality, we're letting you do that until the elections, but once the elections are gone, you will need to take those off. And so this was June, and now that it's September, they have seen incredible ridership on their lanes, and now they're telling the state, please keep the bike path. They're like,
that's great. Yeah. That's really great. And it really does show a model that other cities, you know, here in the US and globally are able to do in terms of just putting down quick infrastructure, and you will see a mode shift and you will actually reach the goals that you're looking to do. Either that's through congestion, car traffic, or even sustainability. But you also touched upon another point, which I want to kind of dive into too, and this is to Henry, with equity, you know, now being front and center among transportation planners, urbanists, elected officials. How can micromobility, when we're driving into that, that's e-scooters, e-bikes, really talk to or address the inequity that we're seeing in the transportation ecosystem? And I know there's been some questions about equity, so I think this will help answer some of those as well, but we'll try to get some of those points in here too.
Yeah, again, I think micromobility just offers a way for, you know, lower income people of color in communities to have access in a way that simply the system was not designed for them to have. And so essentially what we're doing is we're restarting, we're breaking down barriers that have been there. You know, I've heard many times now, I'm not sure where this is attributed to, is that, you know, if you want to find a highway, you just need to look in a Black community. You know, Black communities have been literally separated, where family members separated from each other just due to interstates. What micromobility does is it allows a reconnectivity. And it allows us to center that in equity, meaning that we are recognizing that there has been marginalization, there have been folks who've been left behind, and what we are doing now is providing them with the ability to move around freely. And that's the definition of mobility. And quite frankly, Black communities in the United States in large measure have not had mobility, this idea to move around freely. And then when you put safety on top of that, obviously, safety is at the core of what a lot of micromobility companies do. But when you talk about a comprehensive approach to safety, it's really recognizing that the consumers in many of these large cities, which are people of color, they are now having safety policies put in place in a way that has just never been achieved before. And so that is true equity. The last thing I'll talk about is the access piece. Many of these Black communities have just been cut off, and they are cut off from economic opportunity. So it's not just about loved ones, it's that ability to get to and from work. And this is what this technology offers in a way that can be affordable, it can be accessible, it's sustainable, which I think is a huge one. And of course, it's equitable. Just really quickly on the sustainability piece, we haven't even talked about the fact that, what we're really concerned with in these Black communities, which we've seen with COVID-19 and the sort of the disparate numbers impacting African-American communities, is the air quality and the fact that you're providing this new transportation service that is effectively zero emissions, which is huge. So I think it goes a long way to address the equity question. And for me, I look at micromobility as the gateway technology in which other technologies can look to for best practices and lessons learned in order to make transportation more equitable in Black communities.
I think that's great. Some really great points, Henry. And I'm going to turn to Barb, because I think she has some points also that she wanted to make here. But to answer a question that's in the chat, and I think this is from Ali Geller, how do we make this more equitable? Having people who are now having micromobility in their communities, they need to be working for those companies. They need to have access to understanding the technology, understanding how it's being used and how it can actually help their day-to-day. So if we are just putting scooters on the street or bicycles on the street and saying, look at this great thing we've done for you, but we're not actually involving the community, working with advocacy partners, having them talk to the people that they've been working with for decades. If they're not involved in those conversations, it's never going to be equitable. And also there's the price barrier. So a lot of companies, and especially Lime, we have Lime Access, which means that if you meet a certain criteria, and that's normally if you're on a city, state, or federal dispensation, if you are a member of public housing, you actually get half off of every ride. So those are the type of mode shifts that should be happening in communities, because it then gives people access to the technology. They see how it's useful for themselves and they get to define that. It's not a company defining that for them. All of those are important aspects for making sure this is equitable. But I do want to turn to Barb, so thank you, Barb.
Yeah. I wanted to throw in just a couple of policy points, and this isn't a quick response. This is the kind of thing that takes work. But in Washington, one of the things we had done a couple of years ago was update our e-bike statute to the new class 1, 2, 3 framework. And so then when cities began seeking to regulate e-scooter and sharing, the e-scooter language could be updated sort of in concert with what had already been done with e-bikes. And so we had, at least at the state level, some kind of statutory framework. And then from there, cities are doing what they're doing. The step that I don't think we did that we're talking about, we have an active transportation safety council. We're talking about what are the laws we've got on the books that create an excuse for policing, an opportunity for policing, or some other form of what can be implicit or explicit bias around people using certain modes of transportation in the active transportation space. And I saw one person's comment, are you counting hoverboards and inline skating? We are in our work. It's little wheeled thingies, you're the soft-shelled creature, that's micromobility, that's for us. But we don't have a statutory framework that really makes it clear, where should I use my skateboard? In some cities, it's on the sidewalk. In some cities, it's not on the sidewalk. And so every time we don't define that policy envelope, there's an opportunity for somebody to be stopped for doing the wrong thing, under the law. So if we go through looking at what's on the books about how humans move around and which spaces we expect them to be in, can we undo some of those sort of artificial barriers? And I think that's another element of micromobility use, saying, yes, you can use it, and we've figured out, here's the envelope that you belong in, more or less, and you're not going to get stopped for using it. And I think that's a key that's going to take time both at the state level and then at the individual municipality level.
That's really important. And since we're talking about equity, I see a question here, which is a very important one. And it comes from Stephen Graham. it says, I've seen some hints of resistance in open streets or bike lanes in Black communities by residents who view this as a flavor of gentrification. How should we approach that? And how should we then make it a place where people feel comfortable getting involved in open streets as well, and new mobility?
Well, I'll take that one. I think here in New York City, I think the DOT has made some efforts to communicate open streets, but I'm not sure if that it has been universally understood. And I have two examples of that. In one community, I would say Fort Greene, where I'm from, Fort Greene, Brooklyn, typically a very civically engaged community. Even there was a lot of confusion initially about open streets and what does that mean? Can the UPS truck drive down the street? Those sorts of things. And then in a community where I now live, which is some consider a transit desert, folks say that there's been virtually no communication. Now, I don't know how true that is, but more engagement is needed, especially during this time. And quite frankly, it's difficult to do. You've got city stakeholders being challenged by this pandemic in a way that you just have not seen before. But I think the answer is more engagement. I think there are some tools out there that have recently come together. There's a firm here in New York, I'm trying to remember the name of it, that just put together a whole comprehensive engagement plan for post-COVID about how you work with communities in an era of social distancing. And so we need to rethink that engagement, and we need a lot of work there. These questions are not easy to answer. I would also add that I think fundamentally we've had the wrong people doing engagement. We've had folks who get degrees in urban planning or engineering, and that's great. And they may have taken a few courses on how they engage with a general public. But what we're talking about in many of these communities is those, again, who've been marginalized, those who experience trauma, those who suffer from post-traumatic stress. And you cannot approach them in the same way that you would other communities. You have to be really specific about it. And one of the main approaches that you must have is the idea to listen first, right? And so the question is, how do you approach or engage with a community with a listen first approach in an era of a pandemic when you have to get these open streets initiatives out? It's really challenging, but these are the questions that we're constantly being confronted with. And the last thing I say is, and I've said it before, you have to take this idea of equity. You have to address the question of why. You have to acknowledge who you're actually trying to help and be really intentional about the ways in which you're trying to do it. You can't just check a box. The box encompasses so many things. It's very, very layered. And so whether it's equity in your hiring, whether it's equity in how you're rolling out a policy, the language you're using, it requires a very comprehensive approach. It requires experts who know how to do this. We cannot lean on our own understanding because we bring our own biases. There have been people who have been doing this work for years. And it's good that that work is finally coming to the surface, but we need more of it. It needs to be more ubiquitous. It's not just good enough to hire a diversity inclusion manager to handle some of this work. It's really a comprehensive approach that really needs to rethink and reshape how we approach equity.
I think that's completely right, Henry. And I think that speaks to the necessity of public-private partnerships. So it's not just a company coming in and running a program, it's them really diving in, getting to know that community, having workers sourced from that community to really tell the story and be able to give that level of intelligentsia that we would not get otherwise. So, and we're looking at even supporting infrastructure, changes of that nature. Companies need to make sure that they're talking with those local electeds, those local groups that have been there, and sharing how they feel they can best hopefully help support infrastructure improvement, hope to uplift communities and provide them with solutions in ways that they actually see their life changing. Because if not, it's going to be something that continues to happen to them and not happen with them. I know we're running up on time here. It is 1:15. So I wanted to give a chance for everyone to give a parting word. And I'm sorry if we did not get a chance to answer your questions. We tried to answer all of them. But I'll start with Julie. Any closing words?
Thank you very much for inviting me on this panel. It was a pleasure hearing all of you speak. In conclusion, what I've gotten from this is that from the COVID mainly is the fact that two facts: the fact that Once again, cycling and other types of micromobility gain to work together because basically they have common objectives, being protected from cars, having better infrastructure. So we can't divide them and work against them. They bring the same things, and basically everyone benefits from the same effects. And the second fact is that infrastructure can no longer be thought of as a long-term solution that maybe we will put into place in 5 years. We've realized that we could do so much more quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. Henry?
Sure. What I would say is that, COVID-19 has really allowed the world to stop, and it's allowed us to rethink and reimagine things. And this is a great time to just think out of the box, recognizing historically where we've come from in this country. I think if you're in this profession, whether it's micromobility or transportation broadly, you do have to recognize the responsibility that you have to addressing root causes of systemic racism. Transportation is such an equalizer, and if properly understood, and if equity is operationalized, you really can impact the quality of life for many Americans.
Thank you. And Barb?
So tough to sum up. We've touched on a lot of topics and clearly sort of beyond micromobility. I guess I'd say I think the solutions that we look to transportation we're trying to solve a lot of other problems. I dropped a note in the chat to this effect. And so if we can, as residents of places, if we can ask our leaders to say, don't make them stay in the box they've been in all along, we need to have these cross-functional, cross-department teams talking about the problem, because maybe the problem to the transportation system, maybe the solution to that problem is actually in your economic development office or your housing office or your mental health office. I mean, there are multiple places where we should have folks working together on this that will make our streets feel safer and friendlier and more inviting for everybody. And I would especially ask those of us participating in this who are white to educate ourselves and to recognize, as was said by one of the earlier presenters, the ways in which we end up upholding systemic racism if we're not directly challenging it and working in an anti-racist way.
Thank you so much, Barb. So I just want to add a couple parting thoughts as well. So as we are still in the midst of this pandemic, really finding as many solutions as we can to help people have access to transportation is going to be important. As Henry pointed out, normally it's housing is at the top. Right below that is transportation if you're talking about equity. So the more that we're doing to increase our infrastructure, increase education, increase access to these forms of transportation and making them a way that is reliable and also equitable and sustainable is important. So I really want to just make sure that we're talking about infrastructure, educating yourself, talking to your local elected officials, your local organizations that can actually help put these programs on the ground, because we have seen a shift globally that really speaks to this being one of the more profitable, not even like profitable in the sense of money, but profitable in the sense of helping people have access. So it's a way that we can really do immediate change and have people have something that benefits their lives and they can use it for the purposes that they want. So in the way we view that is a profit to the community. So thank you. And I want to also thank Transportation Alternatives, Families for Safe Streets, and also everyone who's joined us today. Thank you.